It's time to compare Claude versus ChatGPT on one of the most important aspects of writing a novel with AI, and that is generating the story beats and the finished prose from those story beats. So let's get into it and see which one does a little better. For starters, we are going to start here in Claude, and then we'll move on to ChatGPT. And this is the prompt that we're going to start with. You are an expert plotter, and you know exactly the best way to craft a scene for a best-selling novel. Take the following chapter summary and generate a list of 12 highly detailed action beats for a script, which I'll explain. I'll break this down a little bit later. With additional story information to fully flesh out the chapter, make sure to always use proper nouns instead of pronouns. Now, I've crafted this based on a lot of feedback I got within the community. Story beats are, to be completely honest and transparent, not my area of expertise because I tend to write them myself. I find that the results are always better when I write them myself, and I have a lot more specific detail that way. But sometimes doing it this way can really get you started, and doing it this way is going to be a lot better than doing it in pseudo-write, for example. So even if you're using pseudo-write to write your prose, starting with this is a really good way to get those beats so that you can use it in pseudo-write. Now, let's break this down a little bit. First of all, we have the role that we're giving it, and if we were using ChatGPT, you could put this into the custom instructions, or you could just leave it in the prompt like it is right now. There's really no reason not to at this point. And then you could say, take the following chapter summary and generate a list of 12 highly detailed action beats for a script. The action beats for a script was one tip I got in the group, that apparently it tends to do better if you use that word, that phrasing, because it understands what that is a little bit more. And then asking for story information to fully flesh out the chapter is another tip I got. So as you can see, little things like this make it a little bit better than just saying generate 12 story beats for me from this outline. And then make sure to always use proper nouns instead of pronouns is another helpful tip, because when you are later going and producing prose from the summaries, from the story beats rather, it always helps to distinguish who it is you're talking about. And you know, when we are writing these beats ourselves, it's easy to default to say he, she, it, whatever. And sometimes we need to be more specific than that. We always need to be calling back to who's the he or the she that we're talking about in that sentence, because it will sometimes not know. It's getting better, but it will sometimes not know. And so you want to make sure that that is there. And so this is just a good way to make sure that that information is baked in from the beginning. So I'm going to go to Atticus and get this scene description that we've got so far of chapter 1 of one of my novellas that I'm writing. This is the one that I plan on writing with Claude, but rather than just do Claude in this video and then do ChatGPT in another video, I thought we would just compare the two and see how it went. So I'm just going to copy this, put it in below this initial prompt so it has all that information, and then see what happens. And then while that is going, I'm going to copy this entire prompt and put the exact same thing into ChatGPT with no changes. That way we can compare the two a little bit more fairly. All right, back to Claude here, and we now have almost 12 story beats here. And let's read through the first couple of these. It says here, 12 detailed action beats for the first chapter. Holmes and Watson stroll down a busy London street, bantering lightheartedly, when they nearly collide with an elegantly dressed American woman. She grabs Holmes' arms desperately, introducing herself as Stella and begging for his help, saying her senator husband was murdered on the Titanic. Watson gently interrupts to explain the Titanic sinking was a tragic accident, not a murder. Stella insists it was deliberate and related to her husband's research into the occult. Holmes' interest is piqued by her strange certainty. Stella explains her husband angered a dangerous secret society by acquiring a rare book of ancient rituals. She thinks they sabotaged the Titanic to punish him and are now targeting her family. Holmes scrutinizes Stella intensely, deducing her fatigue and disheveled state. He asks pointed questions about her husband's work and the threats against her, testing her story. Wow, this is actually good. I wasn't expecting it to be this good, but these are actually really good story beats. The only thing I would add is that she needs to, at some point here, mention that her daughter was also taken, because that's something that maybe wasn't clear in the prompt. And so I can always add later. I certainly would flesh these out a little bit more, but I think this is some of the best beats that I've seen so far. Let's go ahead and look at the first couple of beats in ChatGPT and see how those did. So here we are, action beat number 1. Holmes and Watson, surrounded in London's infamous fog, stroll down a less trodden pathway. Watson comments on a peculiar piece of trivia about the city, his tone casual, showcasing their deep camaraderie. Stella, a frantic American woman, stumbles out of a nearby alleyway, startling Holmes and Watson, her clothes disheveled, her eyes wild with fear. She pleads for help. She says her husband, a U.S. senator, was murdered on the Titanic, shocking both men. And then Watson, with a comforting hand on Stella's shoulder, tries to reason with her, explaining the widely accepted belief that the Titanic sinking was merely a tragic accident. Stella vehemently dismisses the notion, insisting on foul play. Sherlock, intrigued by Stella's conviction and the complexity of her story, suggests they continue their conversation in a more private setting. He guides her toward their residence at 221B Baker Street, casting a suspicious glance around, indicating he suspects they might be watched. So interestingly, these are not too bad either, and I've noticed that ChatGPT is a lot more specific about what is going on. Like, we have Watson putting his hand on her shoulder. We have that her clothes are disheveled, her eyes wild with fear. And some of this is a little over the top, as ChatGPT tends to do. It's a little melodramatic, but also, like, I can applaud it for trying, right? It's trying to get specific details that we can then use later on. And so this isn't bad. They are both very good, but for different reasons. I feel like what Claude gave here feels more like a plausible story. It feels like an actual summary of a scene. Whereas ChatGPT adds little things like showcasing their deep camaraderie and things like that, which I think is a little weird, and it can turn into something kind of weird later on. I don't really know of a good way to describe it than that. But basically, that's what we're looking at here. So now that we have this, we can now start to turn this into prose. Now, I'll do another video later on about more advanced ways to generate prose, but I just want to see how the two compare. We're going to do 2 beats at a time here, and I'm going to give it a fairly simple prompt, just see on a simple level how well these do. So the prompt is going to be something like, using the following 2 action beats, generate... we'll say 600. Well, no, actually, I'm going to give it 1,000. I don't think it'll do 1,000, but I want it to stretch a little bit. So I'm going to say 1,000 words of prose from this chapter. And then I give it this. We could give it style information. The only thing I'm going to say here is, like, this scene takes place in third person limited point of view from Sherlock's perspective, just so we have that cleared out. And then just now, I think I'll just leave it at that, and we'll see what happens. I'm going to copy this first little bit of the prose of the prompt here, go ahead and let that start to generate, and then I'm going to come over here to ChatGPT. I'm going to paste that first bit in, and then copy the 2 action beats that it gave us and put those below, so that we're essentially keeping the 2 the way they are, and let that generate as well. All right, so looking at Claude here, the prose sounds great, and Claude is really good at this. However, I've noticed already that it has started to, like, I gave it these first 2 prompts and asked it to do 1,000 words based on these 2 beats here. But I've noticed that because it knew all of this that was coming and had read that before, it really just tried to write the whole chapter, basically. And it's got the whole, like, the thing with the explosion and everything here at the end, which happens all the way at the end of the chapter. And we don't want that, obviously. And so I should have known better than to do this like this, but I'm actually going to take this prompt that we had and open a totally new chat so it doesn't remember all those things that we gave it. And now we're going to try this again and see what it does. All right, it is done okay, a little bit better than last time, but even this, it really only had so much material and it kind of rushed through those first two beats and these first couple of paragraphs here, and then just kind of went on it off its own and did its own thing. So that is something about Claude that I'd say is the worst aspect of Claude, is that it has a hard time listening to directions. And if you ask it to write 1,000 words about just these two things, it can't do it. It kind of just does it in whatever amount of words that it feels like it needs, and then just keeps going. And so what you would need to do is take this, edit it down to what it's supposed to be for those two beats, and then try to continue from the end of that and see how it does. What I would do is I would give it the new text that say continue on from here with these next two beats, and so on and so forth. So a lot of wrangling has to happen with Claude, but I will say the prose is great. It requires very little editing. You might want to add to it because it does tend to move through things rather quickly, and sometimes you want to stay with a particular particular beat a little bit longer, and Claude isn't necessarily good at that. So let's go ahead and see what ChatGPT gave us. London, cloaked in its infamous fog, seemed a shadowy and ethereal place, a gray ghost of the city with streets twisting and disappearing like forgotten memories. This is typical ChatGPT, melodrama. It gets overly flowery, but sometimes this stuff is easy to just, quickly edit out. And there are some hidden gems if you can do that. It was in this seemingly endless fog that Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson found themselves strolling down a pathway less trodden, their footsteps muffled by the thick evening mist. So it is doing a better job at really staying in the scene and not rushing onto it like Claude was doing. Did you know, Holmes, Watson began, breaking the hushed silence of the night with his mellifluous voice, that over 1,000 bodies lie beneath London, catacombs, plague pits, forgotten tombs. A warm, fond smile tugged at the corners of Sherlock's mouth. Despite the macabre nature of Watson's trivia, he found a certain comfort in the familiarity of their exchanges. Yes, Watson, Sherlock replied, his tone wry. I was aware. And of course he would, because he is Sherlock Holmes. So it's done okay. Frankly, it does the same thing that Claude does, and it's kind of gone off the end of the prompts here, but that's normal for most AI, and it has not done it to the degree that Claude did. So, comparing the two, I would say, first of all, with the beats, I feel like Claude might have made better beats, but not by a lot, honestly. ChatGPT did well as well, and it gave us some specifics, which I think were really helpful. And so one of the things you could do is sort of mash them together. I'll have a video about how to do that later, but basically it did a decent job at that. But if I had to pick one, I would probably pick Claude. And then for writing prose, I think we maybe need to wrangle it a little bit more and give it a little bit more of a structured prompt. But I have to go with my gut here. I actually think ChatGPT did better in this particular situation. The prose itself was not as good, but sometimes the amount of work that Claude gives you to try and get it up to snuff and get it to do what you want it to do is a lot. Obviously, Claude does a better job with the actual prose, the actual words in the sentence. Claude does do a better job, but you have to wrangle it and get it to come back, and it's so hard to control sometimes. And if you can't do that, you just have to edit it a lot. And so really what Claude gives me feels more like a really, really fleshed out outline that I then have to go and add my own little bits to that, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. A lot of people would do it that way. And there isn't much out of the, once you cut off the irrelevant bits off of Claude, there isn't much that's left for you to do or change, I should say. You don't have to change what it gave you. You just need to add on to it. So it really depends on your style. And honestly, I would recommend that you explore ChatGPT and Claude together and make your own decision on which one you want to use, because each one's going to be better or worse for certain situations. I will do another video, I think, about really getting the most out of writing prose. But until then, I'll see you in the next video.